Good morning, everyone. My name is Pastor Holly, and I am the pastor of Spirit Garage, and it is good for us to be together today. I want to point out to you that if you were with us last week, you heard me talking about a piece of art that Spidey did that says all will be well, because that was a main part of our message yesterday. Nope. This right behind me, there it is. So remember, I was talking about how what I liked about it was that you could just barely see the words coming through the rest of what was going on the art, which feels about right for how all will be well, that it's gonna come into focus sometimes, and it's also going to be surrounded by lots of other things. So if you look up there, you can see like there's the A. This is like backing up a trailer to try to do this with the camera. All will be well. Anyway, thanks for leaving that out for me today so that I could put it up. Or imagine, Spidey, there, you left it for me so I could see it, but I decided to put it up. I hope that's okay. Anyway, as Kern said, we are gathered here today for worship, and it's our Different Lens series. That means we don't have communion today, but we do have Lori with us, who's going to speak to us about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is, well, I'll talk about that in just a second for you, but we're happy to have Lori with us here today, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how I know Lori later on, but we're going to start ourselves off. We have no communion, and the message time is going to reframe that biblical story, which is in Genesis 19. So if you want to read, if you're not familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, open up your Bible or, Google it on Genesis 19, and you'll hear a little bit more about what a paraphrased version of that story of Genesis 19. It's one of about 5 biblical texts that Christians who believe that homosexuality is a sin use to defend this belief, which also means that it is a story that has been used to terrorize queer people for eons. And Lori and I first met working at Bible camp years and years ago, I guess 30 years ago. And it's debatable about which one of us has the loudest laughter.
You.
Like I said, I'll let you decide, but I'm pretty sure that everyone who worked with us out at camp would have been able to hear either one of us from lots of points of camp. And she has occupied lots of Christian spaces as a leader. Let's see, I'm just going to do that. As a leader in her lifetime. But she's also run into many who question her place there or rejected her from that place because of her queer identity. So reconciling and reclaiming these stories in the Bible is part of the work that she has had to do in order to reconcile and reclaim her position as a loved child of God with gifts to offer, not in spite of her queerness, but with all of it. So Lori right now is a Luther Seminary student with maybe a little over a year to go. So I'm happy that through all the noise, she has continued to hear a call from God and the church. And I'm thankful for her leadership within that church and thankful it will continue. We're lucky that she's here to share with us today some of that journey and open up that biblical story to us in a new way, sharing of the wisdom born of that, some of that pain. So this morning, I'm going to center us in our sacred time together by opening with a poem from Mary Oliver called Wild Geese, which I know is a favorite for lots of people. So before we do that, let's just take some deep breaths together. Breathe in the breath of God and breathe it back out into the world. Breathe in God's peace. And breathe it back out into the world. Breathe in God's grace. And breathe it back out into a world that so desperately needs it. And hear these words from Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over again, announcing your place in the family of things. It is good to be together today. We were lucky enough to get to spend a little bit of time last month hanging out when I was on vacation and I went up north. We walked around camp, which is Camp Vermilion in Cook, Minnesota on Lake Vermilion. Got to walk around and walk into all the buildings. The weirdest thing that we were talking about when that happened was that all of the buildings still smell the same. Like the dining hall still smells like, I don't know what I said it smelled like on that day. Hot cocoa and something.
Right.
Probably burned milk cartons or something like that. And the staff lounge is just as moldy as it ever was. I mean, like all of the buildings just have that. I'm sure lots of you out there also have places that you go where you end up, even my mom's house, no matter what house it is, always smells like my mom's house. It's an interesting thing. I only worked there for 2 summers, but Lori, how many summers were you at camp?
Oh gosh. Initially, I want to say 9, but then I left and then came back for a while. So probably total about 13, 14.
Yeah, in a bunch of different capacities, right?
Yes.
Like canoe guide, naturalist, nurse.
Yep, nurse for a summer.
Bunch of different things. But that's not the only Christian space that you've occupied. So I'm anxious to get to the part where we get to learn from you. And I know that you'll tell us about some of that this time. So just to introduce our time together and what we're doing in this series, we know that each person reads the Bible from a particular lens related to who they are and how they were raised and what kinds of things that have happened to people in their lives. And we've also been handed a way of reading the Bible from theologians down through the years, often without us being made aware that what we're hearing is an interpretation, or what we know is an interpretation. And most of those voices have been white men, and some of them may have been queer. We don't know much about that. But when others have approached the text and done good work studying it, they sometimes find new insights and understandings that get to add to the voices that we know from what we hear in history. Everyone's got a perspective. But we sometimes are hearing and finding new insights and understandings that are more helpful to our time and place or to particular groups of people. So I know that you're ready to teach us about a story that you've reclaimed and put a different lens on that, and then the one that's been passed down through conventional channels for a long time. So I'm going to hand this space over to you. Grateful for your teaching and wisdom that you'll offer today.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to be here. With Sodom and Gomorrah, let me tell you a little bit about my background and what has formed the lenses I now look through. So until I was in my mid-teens, I was actually raised in the Pentecostal church. And at least our pastor was very fond of the violent, angry God motif. I think it's common for Pentecostal churches, or at least it was, to read the Bible literally. So everything that's in there is exactly what happened, and there's no gray area whatsoever. And so, so hearing those stories, grew up with this fear of God, that, God's kind of like the angry father who's going to step in and discipline if you step out of line. Then we came to the Lutheran church, and I was very active in the church. I taught Sunday school and vacation Bible school and started working at camp. And all this time, it wasn't until I started working at camp and I was in college that I realized that I was gay. And, so first I went to my pastor about it, as I would hope one would. And I was told that I was just having a faith crisis and maybe I needed to take a break from the church for a while. And at camp, I lived under this fear of, umbrella of fear, knowing that I could be fired if anyone found out. I did confide in a couple people, and that did not go well. And that just actually added to the fear that they would rat on me. So I left the church. I'm like, this is crazy. So those, like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah suddenly was being used to identify me. And I'm like, that's not right. That's not true. And so when I came back, and especially now, so I went from being on the inside to being an outsider. And man, that was soul crushing. That's a really painful place to be. If you've never been in the margins, if you've never been one of the vulnerable, then I don't think you can really understand how much it can destroy you. And so I was just missing spirituality. I was missing a community. So when I did come back to the church, it's completely changed how I look at the Bible. I don't see it as literal. I don't see it as a thing to be feared at all. There's this whole loving God narrative all throughout, from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, that people, they get stuck in this rut of, well, this is what we've been told, so this must be true, and it's not always true. So my lens now, how I tend to look at the Bible is, I'm always looking for who aren't we welcoming in, who is still in the margins that we're not seeing. Are we caring for the vulnerable? How does this story inform my life now to share God's love? Our love of God is shown by how we treat others. And so that's the lens that I approach this. For those who did not, Google, or who are not familiar with the Sodom and Gomorrah story, I'll give you a quick synopsis of it, and then we'll talk a little more about it. So in the story, God sends two angels who have previously, with another one, been at Abraham's, where he displayed lavish hospitality. He sent them to Sodom disguised as travelers to verify the wickedness that he was hearing reports of. And sitting at the city gates was Lot, who is the patriarch Abraham's nephew. Lot and his family are also resident aliens of the city. They're not from that city. They're outsiders as well. And when Lot sees the travelers, he invites them to his home. Well, the angels say, no, you know what? We're just going to sleep in the town square. We're fine. We don't want to impose. And Lot is utterly aghast when he hears this, and he insists that they come and stay at his house. So they all have dinner, a nice meal, and afterwards, as they're relaxing, all of a sudden, all of the men of the city, as it says, young and old, are surrounding Lot's house. And they're demanding that he throw the visitors out to them so that they can rape them. And Lot begs them to change their minds. And in fact, he even offers his own virgin daughters to them to do with as they will. Just leave the men alone. And the men are enraged by this because Lot is the foreigner as well. And they're like, how dare this alien try to tell us what we can do in our city? And so they press in on Lot, and suddenly the angels open the door, reach out and, pull him back in, slam the door, and then blind all of the men so they can't find the door of the house to get in and attack the whole crew of them. The angels then help Lot and his family to escape, and his family being two daughters and his wife. And they warn them, don't look back. Well, of course, the story ends with Lot's wife, who has been unnamed until this whole point, looking back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Now, the Pentecostal version of this that I grew up with was, the moral of the story is that God destroyed the entire city because of the homosexual behavior of the men, and of course, because Lot's wife questioned or disobeyed, she was turned into a pillar of salt. So those are the two things I carried with me all through. But the crazy thing is that this story has absolutely nothing to do with homosexuality. Rape or any sexual violence is never about sex. It's never about sexual desire or lust or love. It's all about domination and humiliation and power and control. So there's no, homosexual love there. But why God punished them is because they violated the norms of hospitality. We might think of hospitality as cake and cookies or cake and coffee when someone comes over. But this is like welcoming strangers, travelers, foreigners in. That's hospitality, making sure that they're safe for the night, giving them food if they need food. And in fact, all throughout the ancient Near East, hospitality was how, people knew that they needed that to survive. They needed one another because especially travelers are vulnerable. Immigrants are vulnerable going to a place where they have no protections. They have no one. And so hospitality, bringing in strangers and caring for them was the norm for everyone. But Sodom wasn't doing that. In fact, Lot, who knows what happened to Lot? We don't know when he first arrived at the city. But he obviously knew what they were about, knew that they were not very welcoming to strangers whatsoever. And of course, that was verified. Now, the problem with this story, as the way it's been interpreted, is that it's been taken in isolation. And with Jewish literature, especially in the Old Testament, you can't ever take any story in isolation. This story is actually part of a 3-story arc that begins with the angel's visit to Abraham, and where he set the gold standard for what hospitality is to entail. I mean, he rolled out the red carpet, so to speak. And then we have the story of Sodom, where they did not do that. And then the 3rd story is actually Judges 19, which is a story that shows how depraved Israel had actually become. And it's actually kind of a horrific story. But that's the 3rd part of this arc. Now, throughout the Old Testament, Sodom, the story of Sodom, is the most referred to story in Genesis. And in every single case, it's talked about in Lamentations, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Ezekiel. In every single one, they cite it's the lack of hospitality or the lack of caring for the vulnerable. Has nothing to do with what they were doing, sexually. And even into the New Testament, Jesus in both Matthew and Luke, when he references Sodom, it's referring to their lack of hospitality. It's their rejection of outsiders, their rejection of visitors. In fact, the only place in the Bible where Sodom is referred to in terms of sexual immorality is in Jude 7. Now, again, if you take it just that verse, then you would think, oh, sexual immorality, well, it must be homosexuality or some sort of, lewd perversion. But again, you can't take it in isolation. If you read the verses before and after, Jude has been talking about, the author of Jude has been talking about the angels in Genesis 6, where the angels came down from heaven and had sex with human women and produced the Nephilim, the giants. And everyone knew that angels and human combination was a bad thing. It was very taboo, and it was an abhorrence. And that's what Jude is talking about. And when he then references the men wanted to have sex with angels. It's not that, they wanted to know the angels. And so that's the reference. It's not that the men were having homosexual relations with one another or even with visitors. It was the angel-human perspective. But where it gets murky is in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. There's a word that in English is translated as sodomites. So that kind of, puts a nail in the coffin of this is what, there are vice lists in both of those. And so this is what is referred to, oh, it must be, sexual immorality, oh, sodomite. But no, the actual word, it's a mistranslation, because the actual word that they're translating as sodomites is arsenokotai, which means pederast, a man who engages in pederasty. And for those who don't know what that is, today we would say pedophilia. But in Greco-Roman culture, it was very common for men of wealth to have, married men of wealth, to have as a sexual partner, plaything, if you will, a young boy. Youth, usually they were teenagers, but sometimes they were younger than that. They were status symbols. And it's not really that far of a cry from what we think of as trophy wives. It's a status symbol. It has nothing to do with really the sex or any sort of homosexual love. It's, something to display. And so that's what pederasty is. It is not anything about homosexual relationships. And so, but because it was linked to Sodom and sodomites, that, we've continued on. So, maybe we need to ask, why is that? Why has that continued? Why has that been allowed to go on? And part of it, if you want to look at the beginnings of Christianity and the early church, because they were pushing back against, the early writers were pushing back against, early church fathers, against the culture, the pagan culture, of which pederasty was very dominant. And so that was deemed, of course, immoral. But also a lot of the early church fathers, as they're called, came from backgrounds as monks, whether as hermits or in monasteries, where there was no physical interaction. And so maybe that's why it continued. Maybe it's more comfortable to put people in places of vulnerability rather than to see them and to respond to them and to help them. That's the power of empire. And, the church was based on empire, unfortunately. And so, our job now is to undo that. The world of the violent, angry God is a very small world with only enough room for a chosen few. Whereas the world of the loving God is so expansive, there's room for everyone in the world. And so I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Here at Spirit Garage, we like to say the words "all means all." So you just ended in just a place that's very familiar to everyone at Spirit Garage. That wide, expansive love of God is for all, and all means all. So thank you for that. Yeah. I'd never thought about the connection between the visitors that visited Abraham and certainly the Judges story too. So that arc of that story that's an interesting connection for me. Cool. Yeah. I want to thank you for taking time and emotional energy to help us to learn from you as you've shared parts of your story and parts of your wisdom. And I know we have folks in our community who will find themselves in your story. And for all of us, expanding our ideas about who God is and who God is for and how God is in the world will be balm for the soul when the Bible has such crazy stories in it that we get to figure out how to work with. So now I just have a few fun questions for you.
All right.
So what book, fiction or nonfiction, has captured your attention lately? And I know you're in some areas, so of course.
Right, there's not a whole lot outside of textbooks. No, actually, an author that I've really come to appreciate is Amy Jill Levine. She's an Orthodox Jew, but who's a professor of New Testament. I love looking at things through her lens. It's very eye-opening.
Yes, I saw her in Denver one time speak about sex, actually. And it was brilliant. She was so great because to speak to a whole room inside of a church with about sex involved saying a lot of words that you don't normally say in those spaces. And so she had this magical way of like making you think the term that she was about to say before she actually said it, so you weren't surprised anymore when she said it. It was brilliant. Amy Jill Levine, that name was. Please check that out. All right, what song always makes you dance?
Well, okay, so I really don't listen much to what we call popular music or popular radio. However, I listen to a lot of traditional fiddle music, especially Scottish, Cape Breton, some Norwegian. So the faster tunes, I do tend to leap awkwardly around the room too.
Leap awkwardly around the room. That's awesome. All right. Do you have a favorite podcast?
You know, I don't really, I've only ever listened to one podcast series, and it was Dolly Parton's America that came out last year.
Nice.
It's the only one I've listened to, though.
I don't think you're the only one. So, all right. If heaven exists and God has a voice, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive?
I would say, welcome home.
Mm-hmm. And can you close out our time with a poem or a quote that speaks to you?
I will. I have a poem. It's actually my favorite poem by Mary Oliver. So I was like, when you said you were going to read Mary Oliver, I'm like, please don't read this one.
You know, I switched since we talked too. Sorry.
Okay. So it's called Messenger. My work is loving the world. Here the sunflowers, there the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here the quickening yeast, there the blue plums. Here the clam deep in the speckled sand. Are my boots old? Is my coat torn? Am I no longer young and still not half perfect? Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. The phoebe, the delphinium, the sheep in the pasture, and the pasture, which is mostly rejoicing, since all ingredients are here, which is gratitude, to be given a mind and a heart and these body clothes, a mouth with which to give shouts of joy to the moth and the wren, to the sleepy dug-up clam, telling them all over and over how it is that we live forever.